Howdy, howdy, howdy. Welcome to Remote Learning for Wednesday, 9:09. So let me get all set up. What we are doing today is we are doing notes for the history part of West and Central Africa. So we talked a little bit about ancient civilizations and ancient empires in West and Central Africa. And now we're going to move from the ancient empires to more modern history. We're going to touch again on those ancient civilizations, the Ghana, Mali, and the Songhai empires, but we're also going to push past them and talk more about European contact and what we see moving forward from there. So what you need to do is open up your ISN on Google Slides and add a new page. Title this page History of West and Central Africa. And then what you're going to do is follow along with the rest of this video and the PowerPoint and add each date to your ISN, creating a working timeline. With extra time at the end of class, you need to use the remainder of class to complete any past assignments. So that would be the work from yesterday. So if you didn't finish those two practice maps and get the screenshots and send them in through Canvas, you need to do that. You can study for the map quiz for Friday, or you can work on your mask project. Last week, we talked about the history of West and Central Africa, and I know that seems like forever ago because we had the long weekend and then just time in general right now with all this quarantine and everything is all blending together, and time just seems in a weird place right now. But we did talk about the history of West and Central Africa somewhat last week. We talked about the ancient empires in this area, so we're going to start with two, that being the Ghana Empire and the Mali Empire. So the first thing we have on our timeline, as you can see at the top, we will have a timeline, and that timeline will be, you'll see the arrows for whatever is happening on this slide. So if we look at this slide, we can see 600 to 1200, Ghana Empire rules Africa and controls salt trade. And we can see that first yellow line goes way past back 1000, past behind 1000 and all the way to 1200. So that represents Ghana's empire ruling Africa, controlling the salt trade. Salt was incredibly important at this time and was even more valuable than gold in many ways because you needed salt in order to cook. If you didn't have gold, then you just didn't have, fancy jewelry and all the shiny baubles and looking good. But if you didn't have salt, you couldn't survive because salt was used to preserve food, which at the time was necessary because they didn't have the modern convenience of the refrigerator. So what they would have to do is they would have to put a bunch of salt on their meat or whatever food they have, and that would make it into almost like a jerky or pickle it in certain ways, and then it would last a lot longer if you kept it in like a clay pot or a terracotta pot. It would last a lot longer, and so you could keep salt, you could use salt to keep food good and in a way have like an ancient form of refrigeration. So salt was incredibly important. Also, salt was used just for taste and just as a general cooking aid. So salt was incredibly important at the time and was extremely necessary for sustaining life. So salt equals life, and salt was super important. So salt made money. So salt equals life, salt equals money. So around 1000 AD, we see the Ghana Empire start to have infighting and squabbles. And so what we see then is around between 1000 AD and 12,040 AD, these new empires start to take over, and one of them being the Mali Empire. So the Mali Empire takes over where Ghana once was and expands even more. And with the Mali Empire, we see the rise of Mansa Musa, who we talked about a lot in the past. Mansa Musa was a great leader, incredibly wealthy, one of the wealthiest people in all of human history. And so Mansa Musa rules the Mali Empire for a long period of time, from 1312 to 1337 AD. He rules over most of Africa and travels throughout a lot of Africa, including the coastline to the north, where he comes in contact with a lot of Europeans. And this is where a lot of Europeans first see the African empires, these African empires, because they had come into contact with Egyptians, but the Egyptians were a little bit different than the people from Ghana and Mali, and then even the Songhai later. So we start to see our first contact with some Europeans through Mansa Musa and his extreme wealth. In 1324, Mansa Musa does his pilgrimage to Mecca. This is what we talked about last week, where he goes and he throws out all the money, lots and lots of wealth, and we watched a couple of videos about him and learned a lot about his pilgrimage to Mecca. He was a Muslim emperor, and so what that means is that he tried to enact a lot of the Islamic teachings on the people in his empire. So that was a lot of education and giving to those less wealthy, and the pilgrimage to Mecca, which is something that every Muslim is supposed to do at least once in their life. And when he came back from Mecca, he brought with him a lot of architects and teachers in order to improve his empire. And so this is where we see the Mali Empire and African empires really start to boost up in size and become more and more and more civilized than we often see portrayed in African history. So next we have the Songhai Empire. So the Songhai Empire lasted for an incredibly long time, from the 1400s all the way into the 1600s. And around the 1600s, we see their split. So the Songhai split in 1600s into many different nations or kingdoms and different areas. So they lasted a long time. They lasted even, we're going to see in a second, that they even lasted after European contact. So the Europeans made contact and started trading with the African kingdoms, and the main one that they traded with was the Songhai. Speaking of European contact, in the late 1400s, so this is around the height of the Songhai Empire, the late 1400s, trade begins between Europeans and Africans. So this is trading different spices and gold and some slaves at this point, not as much as we would see a little bit later on, but this is trading all sorts of goods and materials back and forth, cloths, things like that, different types of vegetables and meats back and forth, and then even trading ideas. So one of the things is different types of sciences and math and architecture all get traded back and forth, the trading of ideas. Around 1500, we see the Europeans start to colonize the Americas and different parts of the world. So the Spanish go to South America, the British go to North America, and the French go to North America, and they all utilize these African slaves. So they go along the coast around like the Ivory Coast and that sort of area, the Gulf of Guinea, all those sorts of areas. They go and they trade slaves, and they buy slaves from African traders and African emperors and people in power there. They trade those slaves, and then they send them off to the Americas, and then they send from there, they use those slaves in order to colonize and gain resources, send those resources to Europe, and then they become money in Europe, and then it just sort of continues in a cycle and grows and grows and grows. And we see that from the 1500s to the 1800s. So at this time, a lot of people in Africa, a lot of the African empires and people in power start to fight more and more. And as they fight, they take slaves, which was something that they naturally did over long periods of time. They took slaves and then they kept them as slaves for themselves and used them for themselves. But then when the Europeans came in, they saw that they could make a lot of money just through slave trading because the Europeans wanted so many slaves. So what they did is they started to gain more and more and gather up more and more and started looking just for slaves rather than getting slaves as a byproduct of whatever raiding or fighting they happen to be doing at the time. And we start to see more and more slaves get pushed out towards the Americas and then even other parts of the world. So 1500s to 1800s, the Atlantic slave trade exists. In 1800, slavery was outlawed in Europe. So we see that there are no more slaves used in Europe, but that doesn't mean that slavery ended. Slavery continued in certain ways throughout all of the 1800s in Africa. So 1800, slavery is outlawed in Europe, so we see the slave trade end. And then in the late 1800s, Europeans start to look to colonize Africa, which they would do completely by about 1908. They would have all of Africa colonized. So what happened is after World War I, the League of Nations, which was the precursor to the United Nations, which we have today, they had said up to that point, no colonizing of Africa was allowed. And then all at once they said all of Africa can be colonized. So it was a mad grab for as much land as people could grab onto. So just about every European country, even those that had lost in World War I, like Germany, gained land and tried to grab as much land as possible in Africa. And so one example is Belgium. Belgium, which is a considerably small country compared to all of its neighbors. And you think about these huge countries like Spain and France and Russia and England at the time, having all this money and having vast empires. Belgium also had colonies of its own, and one of those was in the Congo, which is one of our countries that we are talking about right now. So in Belgian Congo, they found a bunch of diamonds, and so they would work the Africans in the Congo incredibly hard in order to gain as much of these diamonds as they possibly could. And so we saw slavery continue in that way, in which people came in, took over the area, and then forced people to work. So it was slightly different than what we saw before, where they took people and sent them somewhere else. They kept them where they were, but still worked them incredibly hard and gave them harsh punishments if they tried not to work, didn't work as hard as the masters wanted them to, or if they tried to run away. And so here we see in the late 1800s and then the 1900s, early 1900s, we see the Europeans take over all of Africa and colonize all of Africa, gain a lot of resources and a lot of wealth, and also subjugate a lot of the African natives at this time. This does help build an infrastructure for future parts of Africa. So while we do see a lot of Europeans come in and do some atrocities and terrible things to the native Africans at the time, what we do see is also an infrastructure put into place, not just the normal way an infrastructure is defined as roads and bridges and railroads, but also as a form of government. So we see a preliminary form of government put into place, which would be governors. So think about what it was like in the American colonies. There were British governors in charge of the American colonists. The same way, there would be a Belgian governor in charge of the native Congolese. And so eventually, when we would see the African countries gain freedom from their European counterparts, they already had some form of government that they could use in order to better establish themselves. So we do see from the European contact, we do see a form of government put into place, and then some sort of infrastructure that allows for stability in some of these countries. So push towards independence, 1940s to 1960s, we see independence from Europeans gained. So this is around the time of World War II. So after World War II, Places like India start to ask for independence and push away from European control, and we see the same thing with African countries. So part of this is European countries letting go of control of a lot of these places, but a lot of it is also we see Africans wanting freedom and wanting to run their own country and asking for it and taking it for themselves. So with that, a lot of European countries just leave, take everything that they have, get all the governors and everyone out, and then there's just this big empty spot. There's no one in charge. And so you get a lot of anarchy, and then from anarchy, you see certain people start to take control. And so we see the rise of African dictatorships, 1960s to 1990, rise of African dictatorships. So one person can take control of a lot of power, and that power can grow and grow and grow. And then they can find ways to keep themselves in place for long periods of time. So this is one person gets control of a large part of the economy, and then they control that economy and don't let anyone else rise up and gain power. And they maintain a lot of wealth while a lot of people stay very, very poor in the area. And so this goes on from about the 1960s, 70s to about 1990, where we start to see in the early 1990s, a lot of these dictators start to get removed and elected governments put into place. So 1990s dictators removed. Some of these dictatorships that got removed, the space that they left became stable and became very good for the areas, and other places not so much because they were still rocked by these dictatorships for so long that a lot of them weren't necessarily ready or as well equipped for a solid, more democratic form of government, and so they sometimes struggled with that for a little bit before they completely got on their feet. So that concludes the notes for history of Western and Central Africa 2. So we covered the ancient empires and then European contact, and then transition from European contact to modern day, ending in around the early 1990s, around 2000. So what we are going to talk about next is culture and way of life in Africa, but we won't do that until next week because we're going to spend the rest of this week focusing on the map quiz. So the map quiz will be Friday. Make sure that you are studying for it and make sure that you get the assignment from yesterday done, being the 2 practice maps. And then I hope you guys have a great day. I will see you tomorrow. Bye.